Okay, I'll level with all of you. This is the second take. And I want to say why real quick. The reason why is because I went into this and I didn't read it. I was like, all right, I'm just going to copy and paste the lyrics. We're going to look right at it, make it, spontaneous, and just that way it's just all out there. But as I read it, I was like, wait a minute, I gave it a point way too early. And so I had to restart. A couple things before we start. If you're new here, I put up a box, requested people give me 3 songs to analyze. I picked ones I did not know. You won't know who the artist is until after it's over for objectivity. Like I said in my last video on music examinations, that even if this song objectively, by this standard I've created up here, even if it passes a theological smell test, if the teacher is a false teacher, it gets an F. So that's just the way it works. Now, another thing I want to talk about real quick is repetition. And the reason why is because the amount of times I've heard someone say, well, the Psalms are repetitive. Look at Psalm 139. Your steadfast love endures forever, right? It's repeated a lot. Absolutely. And we need to be able to distinguish this. Does the repetition have a purpose, or is it meaningless? And that's really what it boils down to. In the Psalms, you have Hebrew, poetry, and prose, right? Structured. Repetitiveness helped emphasize. It was emphatic. It usually was linked to another point. So it would say a line, your steadfast love endure forever. And then it would say another line, your steadfast loves endure forever. So it would expand, and it served a function and a purpose. In contemporary music, it's usually just copied and pasted. And there's not really a function except to elicit an emotional response. In fact, my Waymaker video and my comments on Waymaker, I received a lot of backlash because of the same thing. Because I talked about repetition. And so they were like, what about the Psalms? I was like, well, if you look at Waymaker, all it is literally copied and paste over and over, back to back. They moved it around a little bit, so it's not back to back all the time. And all it is just emotional and illicit response, or emotional response. And whenever you know who it comes from, it makes more sense. In fact, I had someone who lives in that country reach out and said, you were exactly right about the repetition. That's exactly what they do. They try to get an emotional response so that you tithe more and you sow a seed. And so that comes into play. But a lot of times it seems like it wants to drag out longer. They want to force a worship experience, which I've talked about this several times. If you go to worship on my blog, I've talked about this over and over again. If you have to force an experience, it's not the Holy Spirit they're experiencing, it's your pragmatism. And that's just not, there's not a point. It's useless, it's fruitless, right? So, repetition is based on, of course, how much something is repeated, but also on whether or not it serves a function. So like the song, This Is Our God, it was a Trinitarian song, and the chorus highlighted each Trinitarian, each person in the Trinity. It had a function. And it was also standard chorus repetition instead of being like 5 bridges of the same thing, 3 choruses of the same thing, right? So that comes into play. I try to be objective. I created the standard to be objective. It fails sometimes because, especially with this, I try not to know who the artist is, but it's hard to avoid in most cases. So let's get right into it. In fact, if you want to learn more about this, in particular, I believe my last video was a worship music of heretics or something like that, and song analysis. I kind of go over where I was going with this. Kind of forgot my point system, so I'll have to wing it. All right, so you can hold my every moment, you calm my raging seas, you walk with me through fire, and you heal all my disease. I trust in you, I trust in you. So, let's look here. I'm going to change this to yellow. I'm rusty with my software, so, So, you, God is the subject here. You. Here, you, he's a direct object here. I, as this turns into the subject at the end, but I is the direct object here. And with this, you hold my every moment. So it's talking about what God's doing, which is good, instead of it being completely like, I'm trusting you in this moment. I'm walking with you in the raging seas. So that's good. I appreciate that. At the end, it switches gears here, but there's nothing entirely wrong with that. It's more confessional. So let's look at the theology. You hold my every moment. Now, what this means is kind of ambiguous. You hold my every moment. It doesn't really tell you anything. It just doesn't. Now, knowing who this comes from and that they believe that God is sovereign but not in control, that's kind of the staple of the theology it comes from. It makes me think that it's a type of providence that I can't wrap my head around. So I'll kind of just give it to them but I would say it's ambiguous. You calm my raging seas. Now, if this means, if this ties into this second or this third line, then I'm all for it. The peace that surpasses all understanding. Okay, I'm good with that. You walk with me through fire. That's kind of a biblical reference. Going through the trials with God. He doesn't leave us or forsake us. I'm all for that, right? So these 3 points are, they're fair. They're not theologically rich. They're ambiguous, but they're not bad. They're not wrong. And that's, again, I want to stress that that's a sad mentality, right? Whenever we look at songs and we think, I'm going to write a song worshiping God, singing about how amazing God is, but the best I can come up with is something that a fortune cookie could print out. And that's just kind of sad. 66 books of Revelation, and that's all we can come up with. I mean, there's got to be better artists who can structure, more thought. There's not much to it. And yeah, there is something to be said about simplicity, but I mean, that's so vague that you don't even know what it's talking about. It becomes kind of relative. Anyway, you heal my disease. Now, this is the line I do have a problem with. I'm going to put it in purple. I do like purple. There's nothing against purple. You heal all my disease. Now, if this was talking about like the end times or something, like, in the end, he's going to heal all my disease, I'm all for it. But given the context of these other lines, I highly doubt that's what they mean. In fact, knowing their theology, I know that's not what they mean. Well, Nick, what's the problem with that? Well, because we're not healed of all of our disease on earth. And that's something that we need to understand, is that the spiritual healing is priority over physical healing, and that we die because of physical deterioration. So no matter what, we all physically die. If he healed all of your disease, you wouldn't die, right? And so that's something that we need to understand. There's something to say about having faith, but we have to understand that sometimes God purposely doesn't heal our physical ailments because he wants us to lean into him. Look at Timothy. You talk about the apostles. The apostles healed. The apostles healed amazingly, right? Yet Timothy, the spiritual son of Paul, who Paul held very dearly, had a stomach ailment that he could have healed, but instead he said, "Drink wine for your stomach ailment." Why? I don't know. But the point is that the spiritual son of Paul still had an ailment. So we need to recognize that. You heal all my diseases. I guess you can say, well, that's just a statement of faith that, you heal all my diseases, but it's kind of present, like now, you heal all my diseases. And that's just not always the case. I trust in you. Nothing wrong with that. That's a confessional type statement, right? I believe you're my healer. Nothing wrong with that. I believe you're my healer. Again, if we take that to be what it is, I believe you're my healer, then I'm all for it. God has healed me from a couple addictions. And that was a reference to where I can say I've been healed, but I've also been healed from a corrupted mind. I've been healed from a corrupted heart. I've been healed from, various things like that. Of course, we're still, we still have the presence of sin, but we're free from the power of sin. So he is a healer. I mean, that's one of the beauties of the gospel, is that we've been changed. We're a new creature. So it could apply spiritually. I believe you're all I need. Nothing wrong with that. I believe. Okay. Again, it goes back into what this person is doing more so than about God. And so it's more of a confessional statement, right? And here we go. I believe you're my portion. And I don't really like this line. It feels like it's thrown around. You're my portion. And some of us know what that means from the biblical standpoint, but so many people use it differently that it's relative. And so it kind of loses its meaning. I believe you're my portion. Portion of what? What does that mean? We just throw around language sometimes that doesn't make sense to other people. And I don't think that this is a good example. I think this is a good example of where, like, okay, that sounds like Christianese. What does it mean? So I think that in terms of it being meaningful, it kind of loses substance there. I believe you're more than enough for me. Nothing wrong with that. Amen. Jesus, you're all I need. All right. So here is where repetition begins. I wonder if I can change let's do that one. How about that? I think I can make it. I don't know what I'm doing. All right. So this is repeated. Oh, that was a nice one. All right. Let me make it prettier. So that's repeated. We'll connect it with the blue circle. I believe you're my healer, so we'll connect this one to a red circle. Red circle, I believe you're my healer, so we don't need to cover that again. And then it goes back and we'll use black here, and it repeats again. So far, and here's the thing with these songs, like use the official video version or something like that, actually has these more. The official lyrics usually strip stuff out because it's repetitive. Here they didn't. So you have this one repeated. So basically these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 verses, I guess you can call them, are all repeated. So not looking too good for me on the repetition. It's just kind of meaningless, especially with how vague most of the statements are. Nothing is impossible for you. Let me go to my highlighter. Nothing is impossible for you. Nothing wrong with that. Nothing is impossible. Actually, I don't like that. Nothing is impossible for you. Nothing is impossible. That kind of goes to a realm of where it like extends beyond nothing is impossible for God. It's kind of like nothing's impossible for you. Nothing is impossible, and start talking about all the things that, we can do for us. It starts kind of going out of the bounds of what God actually wills for us as Christians, which again, that's my bias because I know who the artist is. Nothing is impossible for you. You hold my world in your hands. Providence, nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with that. Nothing is impossible for you. Nothing is impossible for you. You hold my world in your hands. So that's repeated. I believe you're my healer. I believe you're all I need. I believe, that's up here. I believe you're my healer. Oops. No, you know what I mean. So that one's repeated too. I believe my portion. You're more than I need. Jesus, you're all I need. More than enough. Jesus, you're all I need. You're my healer. So let's go look at the box. This is my little objective box. For the main categories, you get 1 point. This is the primary point system, which you can get from it. And so anthropology. Anthropology is the doctrine of man. What does this tell us about the doctrine of man? I guess it could tell us that we're dependent upon God. I'll give it a 0.5 for anthropology. For, basically asserting that we're dependent upon God for most everything, right? I mean, healing, being with him in being with us in trials, and Jesus, you're all I need. You're more than enough for me, right? So anthropology, I'll give it a 0.5 for the subject. It talks about God as the subject quite a bit, but I'm not convinced, because it's still talking about all of these things specifically in reference to me. And if I was thinking, if this is like again, because I don't know if this is used in like a worship context, worship should be praise directed to God, with some of us, us in light of God, but about how great God is. And this certainly talks about how great God is to an extent, but it's still all about them. I'll give them a 0.5. And that kind of goes into the distinction that we talked about before, whether or not it's a testimony song or whether or not it's a worship song. Attributes mentioned. This is where it's going to get kind of dicey. We talked about provision a little bit. I'll give them a 0.5, even though it was ambiguous. Healer, we'll give them a 0.5. That's all I see. Healer and so I'll give it a 1. I'll just give it a 1. And so attributes mentioned, there was no attributes mentioned, nothing for there, so no bonus. Persons mentioned Jesus, 0.5. So we'll give it that. So whenever we're looking at redemption, what aspects of redemption are made? Healer. So we'll give it the 1 for redemption with a... I'm just going to give it that 1 because I don't think it deserves an extra 0.5. Yeah, that's all it talks about. All this whole thing is focused on healing, and it doesn't even really say what it is. So it's not even necessarily redemption. I'm tempted to just give it a 0.5 here, but I'll give it a 1. I'm trying to be generous because I know that I am a little bit biased. Is it Christian exclusive? So one of my critiques for a lot of these songs is that they're not Christian exclusive, right? And how can you say that? Well, because a lot of people can mention Jesus, and there's not a problem there. I think that this one could be considered Christian exclusive. Well, no. Yeah, I think that this could be said to be Christian exclusive. Why? Because it says, Jesus, you're all I need. And Jehovah's Witnesses wouldn't elevate Jesus that much. They just wouldn't. And Mormons maybe. Islam's version of Jesus certainly wouldn't. They would agree that you need more than that. So I would say that this is Christian exclusive. There's somewhere it mentions Jesus, but it's so vague that it literally could be sung by Jehovah's Witness or anyone else. So I'll give it that point. Is it congregational? What this means is it directed for a congregation, or is it, primarily individualistic? I think it's safe to give this one no points. Why? Well, because it's all about I, me, and my. A lot of praise songs are all individualistic, so that it can be all about you. But it kind of takes away the whole purpose of congregational singing. You're there to sing as a congregation. We believe these things. You're our healer. There should be more of a congregational awareness if we're doing congregational singing. Otherwise, you might as well just be singing in your car. That's kind of my mentality on that. Repetition. It does not get points for repetition because it really was repetitive. Is it clear? It does not get points for clarity because while they mention some things, it's very ambiguous. So let's see what we got for our total. Let's see. We got 1 here, 2, 2.5, 3.5, 4.5. I believe that's it. 4.5, which puts it like right there. I don't have 0.5s. All right, so we'll give it what's between a C? Well, it'd be there's nothing really between a plus. We'll just give it a C. All right, so we gave it a C. How does that look? Well, I want to throw this in here. We talked about this before. This has become a new clarification for this topic. We have 3 types of worship songs, right? We have those that are all about me with a little bit of God tacked on, which are not praise songs. They're more of testimony songs, if that. Then we have God primarily as a subject with and us in light of God and who he is, which is the Psalms and what I would consider solid worship music. And then we have the Psalms and songs that are all about God, which are ideal in my opinion. But there's nothing wrong with excluding the human experience. So these are both considered valid worship songs. So is this one a worship song? I would actually put it here because it's individualistic and it is primarily about me and what God is doing for me. And it hardly talks about attributes or anything other than what's going on in their life. And so I wouldn't call it a worship song. I would call it a testimony song. So for the C rating, what do I do with the C rating? Well, for the C rating, this song is Healer by Carrie Job. Carrie Job is Word of Faith. And so that's important. I don't know how I can't get rid of this now. Carrie Job is Word of Faith. So these statements like, you heal all my diseases, and nothing is impossible for you down here. I do see those in light of that theology. And so I do think that there's obviously that type of idea. But another thing with Word of Faith, and I mentioned this before with Waymaker, is that for the idea behind Word of Faith is that repetition, is that you basically declare things into existence. So the idea is that you direct faith at God, you declare it, you have enough faith, and it happens. And so all these ideas of nothing is impossible for you, he'll heal every disease, and things like that. The repetition helps with that because you're declaring it over and over again until it becomes or manifests into reality. That's a staple of that philosophy. And so that's something to understand as well. So all in all, because it's by someone who's word of faith, I would give it an F. Overall, I would not consider it a worship song. I don't know that it should be sung in praise. And I also think that if you look at it, just theologically in terms of whether or not I can, pass the theological smell test, then I'll give it that C. But for the most part, it's not a worship song and it gets an F in my book. What are your thoughts? Was I too harsh? Was I too generous? Let me know.